Summer 1943. The Tennessee sun beat down on Camp Crossville, one of America's sprawling prisoner of war camps. Behind the barbed wire, German soldiers, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, lined up for their daily rations. Most expected the worst: watery soup, hard bread, perhaps the kind of starvation diet they had already known in the desert. But then, something happened that none of them could have imagined. A young German private, dusty from weeks of transport, stepped forward and was handed a glass bottle. He looked down at the strange object in his hands. The liquid inside was dark brown, fizzing with bubbles that caught the sunlight. He twisted off the cap and heard the sharp hiss of carbonation. Suspicious at first, he took a sip. The sweetness hit him like a shock. It was cold, sparkling, sugary, and unlike anything he had ever tasted before. The guards told him it was called Coca-Cola. In Germany, it didn't exist. Back home, he had grown used to bitter ersatz coffee and bread that crumbled like sawdust. Here, for 5 cents, the same price American children paid with their allowance, he held in his hand what felt like a miracle. He wasn't alone in his astonishment. All around him, fellow prisoners murmured in disbelief. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads. Could this really be America? The land that Nazi propaganda had mocked as weak, decadent, and divided. Yet here, in a prison camp, thousands of miles from the battlefield, they were drinking ice-cold soda, the kind of luxury German civilians hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't just Coca-Cola. Within days, the prisoners discovered something even more surreal: ice cream. Not a rare treat for the privileged, but a routine dessert. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, served casually in the camp's mess halls as though it were nothing special at all. To men who had gone years without tasting cream or sugar, the frozen sweetness felt like a message from another world. The shock wasn't simply about food, it was about what the food represented. Every sip of Coke, every spoonful of ice cream whispered the same truth. America had abundance beyond imagination. While Germany rationed sugar and coffee, while children grew thin and mothers queued for scraps, here was a nation so rich it gave its enemies luxuries their own people couldn't buy. That day, something began to crack inside the German soldiers. Their faith in the Reich, their belief in its propaganda, their certainty in ultimate victory, all began to falter, not because of bullets or bombs, but because of ice cream and Coca-Cola. It was the first taste of the impossible, and it would change everything. Long before those German prisoners ever tasted Coca-Cola or ice cream, their minds had been carefully filled with a very different picture of America. Back in the Reich, Nazi propaganda ministers painted the United States as weak, disorganized, and racially divided. Films, radio broadcasts, and newspaper columns insisted that Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury, and incapable of enduring the hardships of war. The message was drilled into every soldier. America could produce jazz and Hollywood movies, but not victory. One pamphlet, circulated among Wehrmacht troops in North Africa, sneered at the so-called Yankee Army. According to Nazi writers, American soldiers were undisciplined, cowardly, and too addicted to cigarettes, chewing gum, and chocolate bars to survive a real fight. A captured poster from the time showed a caricature of a fat American GI lounging in comfort while German soldiers starved nobly for the fatherland. To many young men in the Afrika Korps, this propaganda worked. They believed it. They expected that if they were ever captured, they would be thrown into brutal prison camps, left hungry, beaten, and forgotten. After all, wasn't that what Germany did to its enemies? But reality was about to crush those illusions. The first cracks appeared during the surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. Many had spent months on starvation rations, surviving on little more than black bread, watered-down soup, and ersatz coffee made from acorns. They were weary, hardened, and prepared for misery. Instead, they were handed American field rations, the same K rations that U.S. soldiers themselves often complained about. But to these starving Germans, the little cardboard boxes were treasures beyond belief. Inside were crackers, processed cheese, candy, fruit bars, instant coffee, sugar tablets, and even cigarettes. One German officer later confessed to the Red Cross, "We expected to be starved as prisoners." Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had. This confusion about American resources began our education. What began in North Africa would only intensify once they set foot on American soil. For men raised to believe the Reich was destined to dominate the world, nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see in the land they had been taught to despise. The lies of Goebbels and Hitler were beginning to unravel, and Coca-Cola and ice cream were only the beginning. The German Africa Corps had been called the Desert Fox's finest. Hardened under Rommel's command, they had pushed the British back to Egypt, fighting in blistering heat with endless clouds of sand and dust choking their lungs. But by May 1943, it was over. The Allies had won in Tunisia, and the once proud Africa Corps laid down their weapons in mass surrender. For the Germans, defeat was bitter enough, but the march into captivity added insult to injury. Many had lived for months on little more than hard biscuits and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns. Water was scarce, meat rarer still. A soldier's stomach was always empty, and his body always on the edge of collapse. So when the American guards handed out their first meals as prisoners, disbelief spread like wildfire. Instead of starvation rations, the Germans received K-rations, field meals that American GIs often mocked as tasteless and dull. But for these battle-worn men, the little cardboard boxes were feasts. Inside were treasures: cheese spread, fruit bars, crackers, instant coffee, sugar tablets, even chocolate. Cigarettes came standard. What American soldiers groaned about, German prisoners treated like a holiday dinner. One corporal, captured near Bizerte, later wrote, "We had expected a crust of bread, perhaps some watery soup. Instead, they gave us pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and milk." It was as if we had stepped into another world, and the surprises didn't stop there. When the Liberty ships arrived to carry the prisoners across the Atlantic, the Germans braced themselves. They imagined dark, filthy holds, overcrowding, hunger, and sickness, the same way their own army transported prisoners. But what they found left them silent with shock. Each man was given a bunk. They ate in regular shifts, the same meals as the American crew: fresh bread, vegetables, meat, and coffee, sweetened with sugar and milk. At 3,500 calories a day, their rations were richer than what German soldiers had seen in years. And then came the most unbelievable treat of all. On the 4th of July, 1943, aboard the USS General M. B. Stewart, the ship's crew rolled out a steel ice cream machine, 10 gallons per batch. Prisoners were handed bowls of vanilla ice cream, cold and sweet, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Men who hadn't tasted ice cream since before the war sat in stunned silence, their spoons trembling in their hands. Some whispered that it must be a trick, others laughed nervously. But there it was, real ice cream, served casually to prisoners of war, while their families back home in Germany stood in ration lines for black bread. The voyage itself was a classroom in American abundance. The Germans learned that Liberty ships were built faster than they could believe. One completed every 42 hours at peak production. They learned that America had thousands of these vessels, and more were coming. By the time the ships docked in Virginia and Alabama, many prisoners had already begun to doubt everything they'd been told about America. They were beginning to realize that this soft nation, mocked by Nazi propaganda, had resources and power on a scale beyond their comprehension. And they hadn't even seen the prison camps yet. Day. The Liberty ships were unlike anything the German prisoners had ever seen. To them, transport ships were supposed to be dirty, overcrowded, and dangerous. In the Mediterranean, they had watched men packed into cargo holds like cattle, living on scraps of bread and soup, barely able to breathe in the stifling heat. That was how Germany moved prisoners. But these American vessels told another story. The Liberty Ship program was an industrial miracle. At the peak of production, American shipyards turned out one completed ship every 42 hours, a pace so fast that German engineers would have dismissed it as fantasy if they hadn't witnessed the evidence with their own eyes. For the POWs traveling across the Atlantic, every rivet, every engine, every mile sailed was a silent reminder of America's bottomless industrial strength. And the voyage itself revealed something even more shocking. Prisoners were fed 3 meals a day, often the same rations as the crew. Fresh bread, hot coffee with sugar and cream, meat and vegetables, 3,500 calories daily, more food than many German divisions had seen in months of combat. Some ships even had refrigeration systems that kept food fresh across the entire 2-week journey. And then, on holidays or special occasions, the Americans served something utterly unthinkable to men who had lived through years of rationing: ice cream. One ship's log recorded that on the 4th of July 1943, prisoners were served ice cream made in a shipboard machine that churned out 10 gallons at a time. The Germans stared in disbelief. Ice cream at sea? For prisoners? For many, this was the moment they realized they were no longer in the world they had known. Back in Germany, children hadn't seen ice cream in years. Sugar was rationed to the last gram. Even officers went without luxuries. Yet here they were, enemy soldiers, tasting cold, sweet ice cream in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When the ships finally approached the American coast, the astonishment deepened. From the decks, they saw the massive docks of Norfolk, Virginia, a naval base that sprawled across 4,300 acres. Towering cranes swung effortlessly, loading and unloading cargo ships at a pace that dwarfed anything in Europe. Where German ports struggled to handle a fraction of this traffic in a week, Norfolk did it in a day. Prisoners whispered among themselves. Some refused to believe what they were seeing. Could this really be normal? Could a single port in America outmatch the entire industrial capacity of the Reich's major harbors? And yet the evidence was undeniable. At the port exchanges, POWs saw shelves stacked with candy bars from Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, sold for 5 cents apiece, the same price children paid in any American town. They saw bottles of Coca-Cola, not as rare luxuries but as everyday staples. They saw warehouses filled with goods that, to them, felt like the wealth of an empire. The journey inland would only confirm what they already suspected. America was a land of abundance, unlike anything Nazi propaganda had ever prepared them for. For the German prisoners, the voyage across the Atlantic was more than transportation. It was an education. A slow, dawning realization that the war they thought Germany could win might already be lost, and that lesson was only beginning. When the Liberty ships docked, the German prisoners expected the next stage of their journey to feel familiar. In Europe, transport meant cattle cars, 40 men crammed into each wooden wagon, no seats, no ventilation, just a bucket in the corner. Hunger and thirst followed every mile. That was how the Reich moved both its soldiers and its captives. But America did things differently. Instead of cattle cars, the POWs were ushered into passenger coaches. Padded seats, wide windows, overhead fans. For many Germans, this was their first time traveling in such comfort. Guards handed out full meals in dining cars, fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and hot coffee poured into china cups. One prisoner later admitted that he thought it must be some kind of trick. Prisoners weren't supposed to travel like tourists. Yet the truth was simple. This wasn't special treatment. This was just how America worked. As the trains rolled through Virginia, Tennessee, and deep into the American South, the POWs pressed their faces against the windows, staring at a land that defied everything they had been told. Every farmhouse glowed with electric lights, even in the smallest rural towns. Neon signs blinked above diners and drugstores. Gas stations dotted the highways, each one with coolers stocked with Coca-Cola and shelves full of candy bars. Back in Germany, blackout rules had turned cities into darkness since 1940. In rural villages, many homes still had no electricity at all. Here, even the most remote towns sparkled with light. The trains passed factories running full shifts through the night, their windows glowing, their parking lots filled with cars belonging to ordinary workers. In Germany, only the wealthy or party elites drove private cars. But in America, dockhands, mechanics, and factory women all seemed to own them. One prisoner later recalled in his diary, "We passed through dozens of towns in a single night. Each had more electricity than all of Hamburg." The POWs also noticed something else: the ease with which Americans wasted resources. Railway workers smoked cigarettes constantly, throwing half-burned stubs away without a thought. Dock workers drank Coca-Cola, finished half the bottle, and tossed it aside. In one rail yard, prisoners saw crates of sugar left uncovered in the summer sun. When the bags hardened from humidity, the Americans simply discarded them and ordered new supplies. To men who came from a land where every crumb was rationed, every ounce of sugar weighed and counted, this casual abundance was almost insulting. But it was also undeniable proof. America was not struggling, it was thriving. The journey inland was supposed to be a transfer into captivity. Instead, it became a moving classroom, mile after mile of evidence that Nazi propaganda had lied. America wasn't weak, wasn't decadent, wasn't collapsing. It was stronger than any of them had ever imagined. And soon, behind the fences of the prison camps themselves, the Germans would discover just how deep that strength went. The first glimpse of an American POW camp left many Germans speechless. They had braced themselves for barbed wire, filth, and punishment. Instead, what they found looked closer to a small American town. Take Camp Crossville, Tennessee, as an example. Rows of barracks stood neatly in line, each with electric lights, hot water, and flush toilets, luxuries that many German homes had never possessed even before the war. Heating systems kept the winters bearable, while fans and ventilation offered relief in the summer heat. The camps were run with military precision, but they were not designed to humiliate. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were guaranteed certain rights, and the U.S.-bound army went further still. The mess halls served meals that rivaled and often surpassed what American soldiers ate in the field. Bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee were routine, and desserts appeared regularly. But the real shock for many prisoners came from the camp exchanges, the PX stores. Here, German soldiers discovered shelves stocked with things they hadn't seen in years: Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, Hershey bars, Mars bars, chewing gum, fresh fruit, and even beer. Prices were standard, 5 cents for a bottle of soda or a candy bar. For men who had gone years without sweets, the sight was overwhelming, and they could afford it. POWs were paid wages for their labor, 80 cents a day at first, later raised to a full $1. That meant a single day's work could buy 16 bottles of Coke or candy bars. In Germany, such luxuries were either unattainable or reserved for high-ranking officials with special connections. Here, even enemy prisoners could have them daily. The abundance felt unreal. Prisoners saw sugar placed in bowls on mess hall tables for unlimited use. In Germany, sugar was rationed to a few ounces per month, if it was available at all. Some POWs recalled being horrified when they watched American kitchen staff throw away hardened bags of sugar rather than taking the time to steam and recover them. And then there was the matter of ice cream. In many camps with refrigeration, ice cream was served regularly, especially in summer months. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the 4th of July celebration in 1943 featured hand-cranked ice cream freezers turning out gallons of cold, creamy dessert. Prisoners stood watching in disbelief. To use precious resources like sugar, cream, and ice, just for enjoyment, was beyond anything their ration-strained minds could comprehend. By 1944, some camps even had electric ice cream makers, producing flavors that exceeded what German ice cream parlors had offered before the war. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan. Prisoners could buy bars or sandwiches for 10 cents. Large camps ordered 50 to 100 gallons weekly during the summer. Life behind the wire was still captivity. There was monotony, homesickness, and the sting of defeat. But compared to the hunger, deprivation, and fear they had known in Germany, or what Soviet camps would later inflict, the American prison camps felt like another world. For many Germans, the contrast was unbearable. If their enemies could feed and clothe them better than their own Reich had, then what did that say about the cause they had fought for? The cracks in Nazi belief widened with every bottle of Coca-Cola, every spoonful of ice cream, and every candy bar casually unwrapped inside the camp gates. If there was one thing that left the deepest mark on German prisoners of war, it wasn't a weapon, a tank, or even a bomber. It was a bottle of Coca-Cola. By 1943, the Coca-Cola Company had pledged that every American serviceman anywhere in the world could buy a bottle for 5 cents. To keep that promise, the company built bottling plants near military bases, shipped syrup concentrate across oceans, and organized logistics that rivaled any army supply chain. That year alone, Coca-Cola produced 5 billion bottles, an unimaginable figure for men who came from a land where a single chocolate bar was considered a rare treasure. In the camps, crates of Coca-Cola arrived weekly. Historical records show that Camp Hearn, Texas alone, consumed around 7,000 bottles each week during the summer of 1943. For the Germans, it seemed impossible. How could a country at war, sending millions of men across 2 oceans, still produce enough to hand out fizzy soft drinks not just to its soldiers, but even to its prisoners? The shock wasn't just in the taste. It was in the uniformity. Whether a prisoner drank Coca-Cola in Maine, Texas, or California, the flavor was exactly the same. The syrup concentrate was manufactured in Atlanta, shipped across the nation, and bottled with flawless consistency. German industry, even at its peak, had never achieved such standardization. Factories in Berlin, Hamburg, or Munich all produced slight variations in quality. And to the technically minded POWs, engineers, chemists, and machinists, Coca-Cola was proof of an industrial system far more advanced than anything in the Reich. The casual way Americans treated it was perhaps the most shocking of all. Prisoners on work details saw Coca-Cola everywhere. Vending machines at gas stations, coolers in factories, bottles handed to school children. Americans drank it daily, sometimes only half finishing before tossing the rest away. To a German soldier raised on scarcity, watching a teenager throw away half a bottle of Coke felt like witnessing a king waste gold. Soon, Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It became a symbol of abundance, of industry, of American democracy itself. Prisoners joked about it, bartered with it, and measured their camp wages in bottles. To them, Coke wasn't just sweet and fizzy. It was living proof that America could produce luxuries in wartime as easily as Germany struggled to produce bread. One POW later wrote after the war, "Coca-Cola was the proof. If a nation could waste sugar on soda while fighting across the world, then they could not be defeated. We knew then that Germany was finished." It wasn't bombs or tanks that began breaking the faith of captured soldiers. It was the cold, fizzy sweetness of a Coca-Cola bottle in their hands. For the German prisoners, Coca-Cola was shocking enough, but nothing prepared them for ice cream. In Germany, ice cream had vanished from civilian life years earlier. Sugar was rationed to a few ounces a month, milk was scarce, and cream was nearly impossible to find outside of black market channels. Children who had once enjoyed a cone in the park before the war could only dream of it now. Even high-ranking officers rarely tasted it. So, when German POWs in the United States discovered that ice cream was not just available, but routine, the disbelief was overwhelming. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on the 4th of July in 1943, prisoners stood watching as American guards rolled out hand-cranked freezers packed with ice, salt, sugar, and cream. Under the sweltering southern sun, they churned batch after batch of vanilla ice cream, gallons of it, When the tubs were opened and the cold dessert scooped into bowls, many of the Germans simply stared. Ice cream in July for prisoners of war. Some laughed nervously, others whispered in disbelief, and a few simply shook their heads. To use precious resources like sugar and cream just for entertainment food seemed insane. In Germany, such ingredients were guarded as strategic necessities. Here, they were turned into treats for a holiday celebration. And it didn't stop there. By 1944, many large camps had electric ice cream machines capable of producing huge quantities week after week. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan. The flavors exceeded what German ice cream parlors had offered before the war. Prisoners could even buy ice cream bars or sandwiches at the PX stores for 10 cents apiece. Records show that larger camps ordered 50 to 100 gallons of ice cream weekly during the summer months. For men who hadn't tasted anything like it in years, the experience bordered on the surreal. Some described it as their first true moment of doubt, not about America's strength, but about Germany's future. If the Americans could afford to feed even their prisoners luxuries like ice cream, what chance did the Reich have of defeating such a nation? One POW recalled after the war, "The ice cream was more than food. It was a lesson. It told us that America had so much power, so much wealth, that they could waste resources our people back home would kill for." It was then I began to wonder if everything I had believed was a lie. In that frozen sweetness, the Germans tasted not just sugar and cream, but the vast, unstoppable abundance of America. If Coca-Cola was the drink of America, and ice cream its most joyful luxury, then sugar was the quiet giant behind it all. To German prisoners, the sheer amount of sugar in the United States was beyond comprehension. In Germany, sugar had been strictly rationed since 1939. A civilian might receive 4 to 6 ounces per month, barely enough for weak tea, let alone candy. Mothers hoarded it carefully, saving a spoonful here and there to bake a small cake for a child's birthday. For soldiers in the Africa Corps, sugar was almost mythical. Many had gone months without a taste of anything sweet. So when they entered the mess halls of American POW camps, the sight of sugar bowls on every table nearly knocked them over. There it sat, heaped high in glass containers, white and plentiful, with small scoops for anyone to use as they pleased. There were no guards measuring rations, no scales, no restrictions. Prisoners could pour spoon after spoon into their coffee, sweeten oatmeal, or simply eat it raw if they wished. Some POWs recalled being horrified when they watched Americans throw away sugar that had hardened into lumps from humidity. Back home, such waste would have been criminal. In the US, it was cheaper to replace it than to salvage it. And then came the candy bars. In Camp PX stores, shelves were lined with names that would later become legendary. Hershey, Mars, Milky Way, Baby Ruth, Snickers. Each cost 5 cents. The same price any American child would pay at the corner store. For POWs, who earned wages of 80 cents to $1 per day for work, it meant they could buy 10 to 20 candy bars daily if they wanted. One prisoner later joked, "In Germany, we dreamed of bread." In America, I gained weight as a prisoner because I ate chocolate every night. But behind the laughter was something more serious. To the Germans, candy represented more than sugar. It represented industrial might. Each bar required cocoa imported from Africa or South America, sugar refined in vast factories, and a distribution network capable of reaching every corner of the country, even a prison camp in Texas or Mississippi. To see candy treated as a cheap, everyday indulgence, even in wartime, shattered the illusions Nazi propaganda had built. If America could hand out chocolate bars to its enemies, what chance did the Reich have of starving Britain into submission or defeating the US on the battlefield? The POWs began to understand that America's strength was not just in its armies, but in its capacity to make abundance feel ordinary. Sugar, candy, and chocolate, simple pleasures, were weapons of a different kind, eroding German morale more effectively than bombs. Each sweet bite carried the same unspoken message. This is what America can do, and we can do it endlessly. By 1944, most German prisoners of war in the United States were no longer simply sitting behind barbed wire. They were working. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be employed in non-military labor, and the U.S. and Army quickly realized the value of having hundreds of thousands of able-bodied men at hand. The Germans worked in cotton fields, lumber mills, canning factories, and even on road crews. They chopped timber in Wisconsin forests, picked peaches in Georgia, and helped harvest wheat in Kansas. Everywhere they went, they were watched closely, but they were also paid. The wages weren't large, 80 cents to $1 a day, but to the prisoners, it felt like a fortune. Why? Because that money could be spent in the camp exchanges. Inside those PX stores, a German corporal could walk in with his day's pay and come out with 16 bottles of Coca-Cola, or 10 candy bars, or a pouch of American cigarettes. He could even buy stationery and send letters home, writing not of starvation or cruelty, but of Coca-Cola, ice cream, and chocolate bars. For many POWs, it was a surreal reversal of roles. In Germany, civilians stood in ration lines for hours to buy a few ounces of margarine or sugar. Here, their own soldiers, captured and defeated, were buying sweets and sodas as if they were tourists. Some prisoners took special pride in their camp jobs. Skilled workers were often assigned to repair shops or construction crews, where they could use their talents and earn extra privileges. A few were even allowed to play in orchestras or theater groups inside the camps, with instruments purchased from their wages. The wages also gave them a strange sense of dignity. Even though they were prisoners, they weren't beggars. And they weren't reduced to handouts. They worked, they earned, and they spent. That fact alone separated American captivity from the humiliations they had expected. One POW later wrote, "I never thought I would say this, but as a prisoner in America, I lived better than as a free man in Germany during the war. We had sugar, chocolate, cigarettes, even pocket money. Back home, my family had none of these." The lesson wasn't lost on them. America's wealth wasn't just visible in its factories or harbors. It reached down into the smallest details of life, even into the wages of enemy prisoners. Every Coca-Cola bottle they bought, every Hershey bar they unwrapped, was proof that America's supply lines and industry were limitless. And the Germans knew, if this was how America treated its prisoners, then its soldiers in the field must be supplied even better. The contrast was devastating. Slowly, silently, a truth settled into their minds. Germany could not match this. So, for many German prisoners, the first taste of Coca-Cola or ice cream brought laughter. They joked about American childishness, about a country so spoiled it wasted sugar on soft drinks while fighting a world war. But the laughter never lasted long, because every day inside the camps brought new evidence that couldn't be denied, that America was not weak, not decadent, not failing. It was winning. It showed in the food. Hot meals 3 times a day, with meat and vegetables that many German civilians hadn't seen in years. It showed in the lights that burned all night in camp barracks, while cities back home sat in blackout. It showed in the pay slips that let prisoners buy candy bars and Coca-Cola with pocket money earned from honest labor. Slowly, doubt began to creep in. One officer, Friedrich Radke of the Afrika Korps, kept a diary that historians later recovered. In it, he wrote, "I do not understand how they can live like this during war. If they feed us this way, their enemies, then what must they give their own soldiers? And if their soldiers are so well supplied, then how can we hope to defeat them?" Radke was not alone. Across dozens of camps, similar thoughts circulated quietly among the prisoners. At first, many dismissed the abundance as temporary, perhaps a show meant to impress. But weeks turned into months, and the supply never faltered. Candy bars and Coca-Cola crates kept arriving. Ice cream was served every summer. Cigarettes, sugar, and coffee flowed endlessly. Some POWs began to fear writing home honestly, worried that their families in Germany, living on meager rations, would think they were lying. Others sent letters cautiously describing their lives, hinting at luxuries they dared not name. The cracks grew wider when prisoners realized that this abundance was not confined to the camps. On work details outside the wire, they saw American towns glowing with neon signs, diners filled with families eating hamburgers and pie, grocery stores with shelves stocked full. Even in the middle of wartime, Americans lived better than Germans had in peace. The propaganda of Joseph Goebbels had insisted that America was weak, lazy, and divided by race. But what the prisoners saw with their own eyes was a nation not only unified, but overflowing with wealth and energy. For many, it was a shattering moment of truth. If the Reich had lied about America, what else had it lied about? One prisoner later recalled, "The first doubt comes quietly. Then suddenly you realize everything you were told was false. The Reich promised us victory, but here we were, eating ice cream and drinking Coca-Cola in prison camps, while our families starved back home. It was not America that was collapsing, it was Germany." By 1944, the psychological battle was already won. Behind the barbed wire, the foundations of Nazi belief crumbled, not from bombs or bullets, but from sugar, chocolate, and the simple taste of Coca-Cola. In the end, the story of German prisoners of war in America is not one of guns, tanks, or even battles. It is a story of the quiet power of abundance, of how the smallest luxuries broke the strongest ideology. Behind the barbed wire of Texas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, German soldiers discovered a truth that Nazi propaganda could not erase. America was not weak. It was not decadent. It was powerful in ways they had never imagined. So powerful, in fact, that it could waste luxuries on its enemies. Every bottle of Coca-Cola, every spoonful of ice cream, every sugar cube dropped into hot coffee carried the same unspoken message: America has more than enough. And because it has more than enough, it will win. For men raised on scarcity, ration lines, and the strict hand of the Reich, this was devastating. They saw that in the United States, even prisoners lived better than many free Germans back home. They realized that if this was the treatment given to captives, then America's soldiers must be supplied with unimaginable wealth of food, fuel, and equipment. And they were right. The war in Europe was already tilting toward Allied victory. But for these prisoners, the war was lost the moment they sipped Coca-Cola in a prison camp canteen or tasted ice cream on the 4th of July. The sweetness was more than flavor. It was proof that the Reich's promises were lies. Years later, many former POWs would look back on their time in American camps with mixed feelings. Shame for their defeat, but also gratitude for their survival. Some even admitted that the experience had planted the first seeds of doubt that would later help them reject Nazism altogether. America had won not just with tanks and bombers, but with the quiet power of daily life. A candy bar could humble an empire. A bottle of Coke could shake a soldier's faith, and a scoop of ice cream, served casually on a hot summer's day, could do what no battlefield could: convince men that their cause was already doomed. That was the silent weapon of the United States. Not just steel and firepower, but sugar, cream, and a fizzy drink in a glass bottle. Coca-Cola and ice cream had become America's sweetest victory. What do you think? If you were one of those German POWs, would a bottle of Coca-Cola or a scoop of ice cream have changed the way you saw the war? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next incredible tale from World War II, stories of courage, irony, and the little details of history that changed the world.